An atheist journalist believed he had the ultimate argument until Karoline Leavitt hit him with a story that changed everything. The stage was set under the bright studio lights of American Perspectives Tonight, a primetime show known for its heated political and cultural debates. At the center sat Karoline Leavitt, a rising political firebrand, poised and composed. Across from her was Alan Brooks, a veteran journalist with a sharp, unfiltered style, relentless in his questioning. Millions watched, anticipation thick in the air, not just in the studio, but across the country. The debate was marketed as a discussion on leadership and policy, but everyone knew it would escalate into something bigger. Karoline had made a name for herself by standing firm on her principles, never shying away from tough conversations. Alan, on the other hand, was notorious for cornering his guests, exposing what he saw as flaws in their arguments. The first 20 minutes followed a familiar rhythm: economic policies, government regulations, social issues. Karoline handled the rapid-fire questions with confidence, delivering well-prepared, articulate responses. She wasn't just a politician, she was a skilled communicator, someone who knew how to connect with audiences beyond the studio walls. Then, Alan shifted in his chair, his eyes narrowing just slightly, a subtle movement only a seasoned debater would recognize. The energy in the room shifted. Producers, cameramen, and audience members all sensed the conversation was about to take a sharp turn. "Karoline," Alan began, his voice measured, "you often speak about your faith as a guiding principle in your leadership. You've even said that faith plays a role in shaping public policy." She nodded, waiting. "But let's be honest," he continued, leaning forward, "religion, Christianity in particular, is declining in this country. Fewer people than ever believe in a higher power. Science has given us answers that religion never could. And yet, you continue to advocate for faith as if it's some universal truth." A murmur rippled through the studio audience, but Karoline didn't react immediately. She let the question sit, absorbing the weight of it. Alan wasn't just questioning her personal beliefs, he was challenging the very relevance of faith itself. "I ask because," he continued, "there are millions of people in this country who believe faith is nothing more than an outdated crutch, something that holds people back rather than moves them forward. Do you think that's fair? Or are you just unwilling to admit that faith is losing its place in modern America?" The room felt tighter. People shifted in their seats. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every expression, every flicker of reaction. Alan had thrown a match into a dry field, and everyone was waiting to see if Karoline would let it burn or if she'd extinguish it with something unexpected. But Karoline didn't rush to answer. She took a breath, tilted her head slightly, and gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, because she knew exactly what to say next. Alan leaned back, tapping his pen against the desk. He was waiting. The audience was waiting. The silence in the studio wasn't uncomfortable, it was electric. Karoline let the question settle a moment longer before she spoke. "You say faith is an outdated crutch," she said, her voice steady, "that it holds people back. But let me ask you something, Alan." She tilted her head slightly. "What do people turn to when science doesn't have an answer?" Alan's lips twitched, but he didn't interrupt. She continued, "It's easy to dismiss faith when life is comfortable, when your job is secure, your family is healthy, when the world makes sense. But when the ground beneath you disappears, when your child is dying in a hospital bed, when you're staring at a casket, when the doctors say there's nothing more they can do, what do you reach for then?" The room was dead silent. Even the producers, normally whispering behind the cameras, were frozen in place. Alan adjusted his tie, not breaking eye contact. "Karoline, people turn to faith because they're desperate. That doesn't make it real, it makes it comforting." She nodded slightly, as if she had expected that response. "Comfort is not a weakness," she said. "It's human. And faith is more than just comfort, it's resilience. It's hope. It's the belief that even in the darkest moments, there's still meaning. You can call that naive, but I'd argue it's the very thing that has kept people from collapsing under the weight of suffering for thousands of years." Alan exhaled through his nose, shifting in his chair. "So, You're saying belief is necessary for survival? I'm saying belief is what makes survival worth something, she answered. He smiled faintly, shaking his head. You're good, Karoline. But let's talk facts. He gestured slightly, as if resetting the conversation. Religious institutions have been responsible for some of the worst atrocities in history: wars, oppression, corruption, and yet you defend faith as if it's only ever been a force for good. Karoline's expression didn't waver. I won't deny that people have done terrible things in the name of religion. But let's be fair, faith has also been the foundation for some of the greatest acts of courage, sacrifice, and kindness the world has ever seen. The abolition of slavery, the civil rights movement, the countless hospitals, schools, and charities started by people who believed their faith called them to help others. You can't erase that just because some have twisted faith for their own agendas. Alan sat back, studying her. He didn't have an immediate retort, and Karoline took the opportunity to lean in slightly. But if you really want to know why I believe in faith, why I defend it, it's not because of history. It's not because of politics. She paused. It's because of a woman I met 12 years ago. A slight furrow appeared between Alan's brows. A woman? Karoline nodded, her voice softening just slightly. Her name was Margaret, and she taught me something about faith that no debate could ever shake. No one, not Alan, not the audience, was prepared for the story she was about to tell. Karoline rested her hands on the table, her fingers lightly interlaced. Her gaze didn't waver as she began speaking, her voice quieter now, more deliberate. 12 years ago, I was fresh out of college, working as a legislative assistant in Nashville. I spent my days in meetings, answering calls, drafting statements. Back then, politics was everything to me. I believed policy was the most powerful force in the world. But then, I met Margaret. Alan remained silent, his posture rigid. The audience leaned in, drawn not by theatrics, but by something deeper, something real. Margaret was 72 years old. I met her at a community outreach event for seniors, one of those initiatives politicians love to show up to for a quick photo op. But I wasn't there for that. I was just doing my job, taking notes, listening politely, then leaving. But Margaret, she stopped me in my tracks. Karoline let out a small breath, as if the memory itself pressed against her. She had a presence about her, not because she was loud or commanding. In fact, she was soft-spoken. But when she talked, people listened. She carried herself with a quiet strength, the kind that only comes from surviving things that should have broken you. Alan's expression was unreadable, but he wasn't looking at his notes anymore. He was listening. She told me she had buried 2 sons, one from cancer, one killed by a drunk driver. She lost her husband to a stroke. She had no siblings, no close family left. And yet, she sat across from me, smiling, sipping tea, asking how my life was going. Karoline's voice tightened for just a second. I remember asking her how she did it, how she could endure so much loss and still sit there, warm and kind, as if the world hadn't tried to take everything from her. She looked at Alan now, not as an opponent, but simply as a man she was speaking to. She told me something I will never forget. Karoline swallowed, then continued. She said, faith isn't about proof. It's about what keeps you standing when there is no proof. Silence. Even the hum of the cameras seemed to fade into the background. She told me that every morning, she woke up and thanked God. Not because her life had been easy. Not because she had been spared from suffering. But because she was still here. Because she believed, even after everything, that there was still purpose in the days she had left. Karoline exhaled slowly. I was 22 years old, and I thought I understood strength. But Margaret showed me what it really looked like. And I realized then, faith isn't just something people hold onto when they're desperate. It's the thing that keeps them from falling apart. She let the words settle. Alan blinked, his mouth opening slightly as if to respond, but then, he shut it again. Before he could find the right words, Karoline added something that changed everything. Alan's mouth remained slightly open, as if he had something to say but couldn't quite shape the words. The weight of Karoline's story lingered in the air, pressing down on everyone in the studio. The audience, normally quick to react, to whisper, to shift in their seats, was completely still. Even the host, usually eager to keep the energy moving, hesitated. Karoline didn't rush to fill the silence. She let it stretch. Alan finally cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his seat. "That's a powerful story," he admitted, his voice quieter than before. "But don't you think it's just that? A story?" Margaret found something that worked for her, but that doesn't mean faith is some universal truth. Karoline nodded slightly, as if she had expected that response. "You're right about one thing," she said. "Faith isn't about proving something to other people. It's about what people live through. And if you listen, really listen, you'll hear that story told a million different ways." Alan exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "But see, that's my issue, Karoline. Faith isn't measurable. It's built on emotions, experiences, things that can't be quantified. And yet, people use it to justify decisions that affect everyone." Karoline tilted her head. "You mean like hope?" Alan blinked. "What?" "Hope," she repeated. "It's not measurable. It's not scientific. You can't prove it exists in any tangible way. And yet, people fight wars for it. They survive the impossible because of it. They hold on to it even when logic says they shouldn't." She let that sink in before continuing. "Would you tell someone who lost their home in a tornado that their hope is just an emotional crutch? That their belief in something better isn't real because it can't be put under a microscope?" Alan shifted in his chair again, but he didn't interrupt. "That's the thing about faith," Karoline continued. "It's not about controlling people. It's not about forcing a belief on anyone. It's about how people make sense of the hardest parts of life. You can call it irrational, but when someone loses everything and still gets up the next day, still finds the strength to keep going, there's something in that. Something you can't measure. But you also can't ignore." Alan's fingers tapped lightly against the desk. His usual sharpness had softened. He wasn't just debating anymore. He was thinking. The host finally interjected, sensing the shift in the room. "Alan, do you have a response to that?" Alan opened his mouth, then closed it. He glanced toward the audience, as if searching for some kind of reaction to ground himself. But no one spoke. No one moved. When he finally answered, his voice lacked its earlier edge. "I think," he hesitated. "I think I need to process that." A murmur rippled through the audience. It wasn't the dramatic rebuttal they had been expecting. It wasn't an explosive takedown or a definitive win. It was something far more rare, a moment of honesty. But the real reaction, the one that would send shockwaves across the country, was still to come. The debate wrapped up moments later, but the conversation was far from over. The usual applause that followed the closing statements felt hesitant, as if the audience wasn't sure how to react. People weren't walking away with just another political sound bite. They had felt something. And that wasn't easy to shake. Alan gave Karoline a small nod before removing his mic and stepping off stage. He didn't linger for small talk or post-show commentary. Instead, he walked straight toward the exit, his posture stiff, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Karoline, however, remained seated for a moment longer. She could hear the whispers from the crew, see the way the audience exchanged glances. Some looked moved, others unsettled, but no one looked unaffected. The moment the cameras cut, the first wave hit. Her phone buzzed nonstop, messages, missed calls, notifications piling up. Social media had exploded, clips of the exchange already circulating, people dissecting every moment. But what shocked Karoline the most wasn't just the reaction from her usual supporters, it was the response from the other side. "I don't consider myself religious, but what she said really made me think. I've never heard someone defend faith without attacking the other side. That was different. This wasn't about politics, this was about something bigger." Comment after comment, post after post, people weren't arguing the way they normally did. Sure, there were the usual critics, the expected backlash from those who dismissed the entire conversation, but something was happening that Karoline hadn't seen in a long time. People weren't just reacting, they were listening. Her team was already in motion, scrambling to respond to media requests. News outlets were running headlines within the hour. Karoline Leavitt leaves journalists speechless, a rare debate moment no one saw coming. Did this conversation just shift the debate on faith in America? Even late-night talk shows, which rarely gave conservative figures a fair shake, were covering it, not with mockery, but with genuine discussion. And then there was Alan. He had remained silent for the rest of the night, no tweets, no interviews, no follow-up commentary. He was usually the first to post a reaction, to control the narrative, but now, nothing. Until the next morning. At exactly 8:37 a.m., he broke his silence with a single post. I've been in journalism for over 30 years. Last night was the first time I walked away from an interview realizing I had more questions than answers. That was it. No grand statements, no damage control, just honesty. And that was all it took to set off another tidal wave. But the true impact of what had happened wouldn't be clear until days later. What had started as a standard political debate had transformed into something far more profound. It wasn't just about Karoline or Alan anymore, it was about something people had been hesitant to admit for years. People were searching for something deeper. It became impossible to scroll through the internet without seeing the debate dissected from every angle. Podcasters, columnists, and commentators all weighed in. Some called it a defining moment for faith in public discourse, others called it a wake-up call. But the most surprising reactions came from the most unexpected places. A well-known comedian, famous for ridiculing religion, admitted on his podcast, "Look, I still don't believe in God, but that woman made me wish I did." And that's saying something. A prominent scientist tweeted, "Faith and science don't have to be enemies." Last night, I was reminded why so many still hold on to belief even in the face of uncertainty. And then there were the emails. Karoline's inbox had always been full, supporters, critics, and the occasional political request, but now she was receiving messages from people who didn't fit into any of those categories. One stood out. It was from a woman named Rebecca. "I haven't stepped foot in a church in 20 years. I lost my faith a long time ago. But after watching your debate, I sat in my car and cried. Not because I suddenly found God or anything dramatic like that, but because I realized something. I missed believing in something bigger than myself. I didn't even know how much until last night. Thank you for making me think." Karoline read the email twice, then a third time. She had spent her entire career in politics, fighting for policies, debating over laws, but this was different. This wasn't about winning an argument or securing votes. This was about something that couldn't be measured in polls or political victories. It was about a conversation people had been too afraid to have. And it wasn't just Rebecca. Over the next few weeks, stories poured in, people sharing their own Margarets, their grandmothers, their neighbors, the stranger in the hospital waiting room who had whispered words of faith when they needed it most. This wasn't about proving one side right and the other wrong. It wasn't about conversions or ideological victories. It was about reminding people that faith, whether in God, in humanity, or in something yet to be understood, wasn't weakness. It was what kept people standing. And that realization? That was something no debate could ever erase. As the buzz around the debate slowly began to settle, one thing became clear: this wasn't just another political moment. It wasn't something that would be forgotten in a news cycle or lost in the endless noise of internet discourse. It was a reminder. A reminder that no matter how divided people seemed, no matter how loudly the world shouted that faith was outdated, unnecessary, or obsolete, there were still people searching for meaning, searching for something beyond the tangible. Karoline had never set out to change minds that night, she had simply told a story. But sometimes, a story was all it took. And if this story made you think, if it stirred something in you, then don't let it end here. Keep asking questions. Keep searching. Keep listening. Because sometimes, the answers we're looking for don't come from winning an argument, they come from the conversations we never expected to have.